The neighborhood had always seemed like the kind of place where nothing dramatic could possibly happen. It was a carefully groomed suburb where every lawn looked cloned from the next, where the mailboxes stood in perfect rows, and where the homeowners association seemed to hover like an invisible force, maintaining order with the same vigilance as a strict librarian. For years, the HOA had kept its power mostly in the background, sending out the occasional passive-aggressive reminder about garbage placement or warning someone about mismatched holiday lights. Petty, predictable, and largely ignorable. But everything shifted the moment the parking spot became contested territory. The spot in question wasn't extraordinary at first glance. It wasn't covered, nor did it have any special markings. It was simply the parking space directly in front of my townhouse, a 4-step walk from my front door. When I bought the place, the real estate agent had practically sung its praises, emphasizing how valuable it was to have a space so close to the unit. In our neighborhood, where visitor parking was limited and street parking was almost always full, convenience was a rare luxury. Some people had to park nearly a block away and walk with groceries dangling from their forearms. I didn't. My parking spot was printed on the closing documents, outlined on the property map, and included in the HOA records as part of my deeded property. For 3 years, no one questioned it. Then came the letter. It was stuffed between the usual stack of coupons and bills, printed on thick, officious-looking paper with the HOA logo at the top, the ink slightly smudged as if rushed out of a printer. The letter claimed the HOA had reevaluated the layout of community parking and, according to their new assessment, my spot was misallocated. The letter declared the space would be reassigned to general HOA use, with a new communal map forthcoming. The phrasing was suspiciously confident, almost triumphant, as if they were announcing a long-awaited correction. There was no request for discussion, no scheduled meeting, just a statement of intent. I read it 3 times, and each time the confusion morphed into disbelief, then irritation, then a sharp sting of indignation that rooted itself deep. This was my spot, not metaphorically, not emotionally, legally. Still, the HOA had included a friendly closing line that suggested I could reach out with any questions. So I did. I emailed them copies of my deed, the property maps, the highlighted section showing the exact dimensions of the parking space legally attached to my townhouse. I wrote a polite explanation, noting the spot wasn't common property and therefore couldn't be reassigned. 2 days later came their response. A curt, 2-sentence declaration stating the documents I provided were outdated and that the HOA had the right to make necessary adjustments for community safety and harmony. No elaboration. No acknowledgement of the legal implications. Harmony, apparently, was synonymous with taking what wasn't theirs. At first, I chalked it up to a mistake. Maybe a new board had misread something or used an outdated map of their own. But the more I dug into the HOA's recent decisions, the more patterns began to emerge. Patterns showing a board eager to overstep, to broaden its control, and to reshape the community as it saw fit. The parking reallocation, I learned, was being framed as a push for neighborly fairness. The official line was that some homeowners had closer parking than others, and that the board wanted to equalize convenience. Equalize convenience by removing legally deeded spaces. I wasn't the first target. I discovered that 2 months prior, the HOA had attempted something similar with a couple on the opposite side of the neighborhood, claiming their corner garden bed encroached on communal space. They fought it, but ultimately conceded under pressure after receiving multiple fines. Their story didn't spread because they didn't know how to fight back publicly. I wasn't planning on being another quiet casualty in the HOA's slow creep of authority. The real trouble started when a bright orange towing notice appeared on my car windshield one Saturday morning. The laminated sheet, sealed and bold, stood out like a slap. According to the notice, my vehicle was parked in a restricted area pending reassignment. The car will be towed if not removed within 24 hours. That's when the line between inconvenience and violation snapped clean in two. It was one thing to threaten a parking spot. It was another to threaten the property attached to it. I removed the notice and immediately marched to the HOA office down the street, a converted garage that smelled faintly of air freshener and smugness. The office was closed, though their business hours claimed otherwise. A handwritten note on the door said, "Back soon," taped crookedly and fluttering in the breeze. The irony of a rule-enforcing body refusing to follow its own schedule wasn't lost on me. So I filed a formal complaint. I sent a certified letter detailing the deed implications, the towing notice, and my intention to escalate legally if necessary. I documented everything: dates, photos, emails, timestamps of unanswered calls. I knew I needed a paper trail. 3 days later, the retaliation began. The HOA issued me a violation notice for improper trash bin placement. Then, a day later, another notice for excessive lawn edging irregularities, a phrase that sounded like it had been generated by someone trying to sound important. Over the next week, I received 4 more violations, each more absurd than the last, like the board was scrambling to manufacture problems. The fines piled up in bold print, though the spacing between the accusations betrayed the rushed nature of their campaign. It wasn't just about the parking spot anymore. It was about power. They were trying to intimidate me into compliance. That's when the idea of going public first flickered into existence. I watched enough viral HOA horror stories online to know the pattern. The board overreaches, the homeowner fights back, the internet erupts with outrage. My situation fit the mold perfectly. I wasn't looking for fame, just fairness. But the more the HOA pushed, the clearer it became that they underestimated just how widely this could reach. I began collecting not just documents, but footage, photos of every violation notice, screenshots of every email, videos walking through the parking space lines, narrating the measurements with the deed held visibly in frame. If the HOA wanted a battle, I would give them one, with the entire country as the audience. And just as I finalized the last clip for what would become the first public post, something unexpected happened. Late one evening, while I was setting up my files, a new envelope slipped under my door. This one wasn't printed. It wasn't official looking. It was a handwritten note, shaky and rushed, containing only one sentence. 6 words that shifted the entire situation into a new, unpredictable direction. It said, "You're not the only one fighting." The implication was clear, the intent unmistakable. I wasn't alone, and the HOA had just made the biggest mistake of its existence. The anonymous note slipped under the door, lingered in my mind longer than any of the HOA's threats. Its shaky handwriting suggested urgency, maybe even fear, but the meaning was unmistakable. Whoever wrote it knew something or had experienced something, and they were reaching out quietly, perhaps carefully, to let me know the battle I thought I was fighting alone had deeper roots in the community. The HOA's power wasn't simply overstated. It was entrenched, weaponized, and quietly endured by people who had been worn down over time. That realization reshaped everything. I had expected resistance, maybe legal maneuvering, maybe pettiness, but not a hidden chorus of neighbors who had been subdued into silence. The HOA hadn't merely overstepped lately. It had been building its control gradually, one small confiscation of power at a time. Now, my refusal to surrender my parking spot wasn't just a nuisance to them. It was a threat to the entire system they'd built. I studied the note for several minutes, replaying every encounter I'd had with neighbors over the years. There were the polite smiles, the nods across driveways, the people who waved and shuffled quickly inside their homes whenever HOA board members strolled by during their weekly neighborhood walkthroughs. I had long assumed their discomfort came from the awkwardness of small talk. Now a different picture formed, one where neighbors learned that keeping their heads down meant fewer fines, fewer letters, fewer retaliatory violations. Compliance had become its own silent currency. The next morning, I began paying attention, not just in passing, but deliberately. I watched the street, observed the board members' patterns, noted the way homeowners reacted. I noticed how one family quickly rolled their trash bins back inside after a board member passed, as though afraid of being caught in a 2-minute window of technical noncompliance. Another homeowner hustled to remove a garden gnome from their porch after receiving a terse reminder about decorative uniformity. Fear hung in the air like thick humidity, unspoken, suffocating, accepted. My parking situation was simply the latest target. As I organized the files for my public expose, I kept thinking about the unseen writer of the note. Their subtle warning felt like an invitation to look below the surface, and once I did, the cracks appeared everywhere. I noticed a neighbor's fence that had been partially removed, as though in mid-project. Another homeowner had patched over 3 different paint colors on their garage, presumably in response to conflicting HOA instructions. These weren't isolated annoyances. They were signs of a community micromanaged into exhaustion. The next piece of evidence arrived unintentionally. During one of the HOA's routine drive-bys, a folder slipped from the board president's passenger seat as she stepped out of her car. Papers scattered across the pavement, and while the president scrambled to collect them, a few pages remained momentarily exposed. They weren't random documents, they were lists. Names, addresses, categories, and what appeared to be risk assessments. Homeowners were labeled under headings like compliant, borderline, and problematic, with handwritten notes referencing past interactions, fines, disputes, and even personal habits that had nothing to do with property rules. I had seen enough to recognize that my situation wasn't an accident. I had been marked, and the moment I resisted, I was escalated from a minor inconvenience to a full-blown problematic. The more I uncovered, the more determined I became to expose the truth, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been forced into submission. My videos and documentation shifted from a personal defense to a comprehensive record of the HOA's overreach. I compiled timelines, incident histories, and evidence of inconsistencies between the HOA's posted policies and their actual enforcement practices. I cross-referenced dates and compared fines between homeowners. A pattern emerged that suggested favoritism, manipulation, and retaliation. But going public was a significant leap, one that couldn't be undone. Before I posted anything, I wanted to understand just how deep the rot went. The community felt divided, some homes pristine and rule-compliant to the point of sterility, others showing subtle signs of strain, like broken shutters or untrimmed vines, evidence of people too weary to keep up or too frustrated to care. One evening, while reviewing footage in my living room, I noticed a shadow pausing at the edge of my driveway. It lingered for a few seconds, and when I stepped outside later, I found another note tucked under a potted plant, hidden carefully out of sight. This one was longer, written in the same shaky handwriting as the first. The writer explained that they had lived in the community for over a decade and had watched the HOA grow more aggressive each year. They revealed that several homeowners had attempted to challenge the HOA's decisions, only to be met with fines, legal threats, or public shaming during board meetings. According to the letter, one homeowner had even tried to run for a position on the board to initiate reforms, but was pushed out after the HOA found a series of technical violations that disqualified them. The anonymous neighbor confessed they had considered moving away multiple times, but couldn't afford to leave. Their final words hinted at something darker. They claimed the HOA was hiding financial irregularities, implicating that funds collected for violations and fees were being diverted, though they didn't specify where or by whom. The revelation felt like a match tossed into dry grass. Financial misconduct wasn't just overreach, it was the kind of thing that turned local disputes into national headlines. It was the kind of scandal that a property drama channel would seize on instantly. And if my suspicion was right, the HOA's attempt to seize my parking spot wasn't about fairness or harmony. It was about consolidating power, distracting homeowners, and covering tracks that were becoming harder to hide. I spent the following days gathering every piece of publicly available financial information the HOA had released over the years. Most of it was vague, with generalized budget categories and intentionally broad descriptions. Still, inconsistencies appeared when compared across different years, especially in categories labeled maintenance, legal expenditures, and community improvements. The numbers fluctuated in ways that didn't match any visible work done in the neighborhood. If the anonymous writer was right, there was a story here, one significantly bigger than a parking spot. My phone buzzed constantly with violation notices, but they had become background noise. The HOA, oblivious to the broader storm forming behind the scenes, continued their petty intimidation attempts as though they still believed they could force me into submission. They had no idea that the moment I clicked upload, the narrative would shift entirely out of their control. Everything was ready. The evidence was organized, the videos were edited, the timeline was assembled, and the story was clear. All that remained was deciding when to release it. But before I could make that final move, something else happened. Something that proved the HOA wasn't just watching my driveway or my yard. They were watching me, and they were preparing to escalate. The first sign that the HOA had turned its full attention toward me appeared early one morning as I stepped outside to document the condition of my parking spot yet again. The air was crisp, the kind that sharpened every sound, making even distant footsteps clear. That's when I noticed the new fixture installed at an angle on a pole across from my townhouse. A small, discreet security camera, newly wired and suspiciously aimed directly at my driveway. It wasn't part of the community's existing security infrastructure. I knew those cameras well, their placements predetermined long before I moved in. This one was different, new, strategically angled, watching. It didn't take a genius to understand what it meant. The HOA had decided to escalate their monitoring efforts, hoping to catch me in some kind of infraction they could weaponize. Their behavior had evolved from petty to predatory. The camera represented a shift from passive harassment to active surveillance, and as I stared at its unblinking lens, the message was unmistakable. They weren't just monitoring my property. They were monitoring me. The retaliation machine had awakened. By midday, more evidence of their campaign surfaced. A fluorescent orange citation was taped to my door, this one claiming I had failed to maintain clear visibility of exterior address numbering. The numbers on my house were perfectly visible, mounted in metal just beneath the porch light. I photographed them, noted the timestamp, flipped through my growing archive of absurd violations, and added the new one to the stack. The HOA wasn't attempting to hide their intentions anymore. They weren't even pretending the violations were legitimate. They were flooding me with accusations, hoping to break me under the weight of sheer volume. It was a tactic designed to exhaust rather than enforce. If they could bury me in paperwork, they believed they could force a surrender. But the more they tried to crush my resolve, the more focused I became. Over the next few days, the violations increased in frequency. One notice accused me of having non-uniform shrub height. Another cited debris accumulation, referencing a single fallen leaf that had landed on my walkway. The most ridiculous one accused me of improper porch lighting color temperature, claiming my warm-tone bulb didn't meet the association's guidelines for uniform exterior illumination. I documented every detail, the angle of the porch light, the type of bulb, the brightness level, even the shade of the light at night. Ridiculous or not, everything became evidence. Every unreasonable accusation strengthened the case I was building. Then came the letter that changed the tone of the conflict entirely. It arrived in an oversized envelope with a crimson border, a color used only for serious notices. The letter inside was longer than usual, printed with stiff, formal language. It stated that due to my continued disregard for community guidelines, the HOA was initiating proceedings to restrict my access to communal amenities until I demonstrated a renewed commitment to harmonious living. Amenities included the pool, the small community center, and, most importantly, the communal parking areas. The letter concluded with a threat of escalating fines should I continue to disrupt the integrity of the community. Effectively, they were trying to isolate me. They wanted to turn my neighbors against me by framing me as a problem resident, someone creating disorder rather than exposing it. By restricting my access to shared spaces, they hoped to signal to the community that I was an outlier, someone toxic to be avoided. It was social punishment layered beneath bureaucratic language, subtle but powerful. But the isolation they intended didn't materialize. Instead, something unexpected started to take shape. Small at first, but noticeable in the way certain neighbors lingered near their windows, watching the board members with increasing caution. People who had quietly endured their own harassment now recognized familiar tactics being used against me. The anonymous letters had hinted at a collective unease, but unrest was beginning to take visible form. I noticed one neighbor placing their garbage bins slightly earlier than usual, as if testing whether the board would pounce on them with the same vigor they had shown me. Another homeowner left decorative planters on their porch that slightly broke uniformity rules, not enough to provoke immediate action, but enough to show subtle defiance. These weren't full acts of rebellion, just tiny flickers of resistance from people who had grown tired of being watched, judged, and controlled. Still, the HOA pushed harder. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and cast long shadows across the street, a group of board members arrived in force. They moved with a purpose, clipboards held like shields, pens ready to jot down infractions. They circled my house like vultures around a carcass, examining every inch of the exterior. One gestured toward the gutters, another pointed at my lawn, a third inspected the edge of the driveway, as though searching for a violation microscopic in size. The entire scene was conducted with the silent severity of an inspection squad, as if they intended to uncover evidence of wrongdoing even if it didn't exist. Their presence drew attention. Curtains shifted across the street. A few neighbors stepped onto their porches under the pretense of watering plants or checking mail. The atmosphere thickened with quiet tension. Even without words, everyone understood this was no ordinary inspection. The HOA was sending a message to the entire block. Challenge us, and this will happen to you too. What they didn't realize was that their intimidation was fueling something far more powerful than compliance. It was birthing a narrative, one that would soon spill beyond the boundaries of our quiet neighborhood. That night, as I reviewed the footage of their inspection, I realized something chilling. One of the board members had paused near a side window, peering inside for longer than necessary. It wasn't just a glance. It was an intrusion, a moment of overreach that crossed from public authority into personal privacy. They were no longer satisfied with controlling property. They wanted to watch me inside my home. That discovery clarified everything. There was no time left to weigh options or consider subtlety. Whatever was happening in the HOA was far more invasive, far more dangerous than I had first believed. The anonymous neighbor's warning rang louder now, echoing through every decision I had made. The financial irregularities, the lists of problematic homeowners, the surveillance camera, the escalating violations, they were all pieces of one picture. The HOA wasn't merely corrupted. It was emboldened, and it thought it was untouchable. I finalized the video. Every clip was edited, every document scanned, every violation lined up in chronological order. The footage of the board's inspection, the surveillance camera, the neighbor's anonymous notes, all of it formed a narrative impossible to ignore. When the internet saw this, it wouldn't be a neighborhood dispute. It would be a scandal. I hovered over the upload button, understanding what came next. Once I pressed it, there would be no turning back. The HOA would react, and the entire community would be pulled into the storm. But before I could upload it, something happened that none of us were prepared for. A homeowner, someone I barely knew, approached me at dusk. Their movements were cautious, their posture tight, as though afraid to be seen near my house. They didn't speak, but they slipped a USB drive into my hand before hurrying away. On the drive was a folder labeled with one simple word: evidence. The USB drive was small, unmarked, and deceptively ordinary. There was nothing about its appearance that suggested it contained anything significant, yet the way the homeowner had delivered it, hurried, tense, with furtive glances cast over their shoulder, told a different story. This wasn't just a stray collection of neighborhood grievances. This was something dangerous, something someone believed I needed to see before taking my fight public. Inside my house, I set the drive on the table and hesitated for a moment, aware that whatever was stored on it could push the conflict beyond anything I had anticipated. The HOA had already escalated to invasive surveillance and mass retaliation. If there was more, if the anonymous neighbors were correct about financial misconduct, then I was on the verge of uncovering a scandal that could cause a structural collapse well beyond a simple suburban dispute. I plugged in the USB. It contained a single folder. Inside were subfolders organized by year, each labeled with a range of dates. They stretched back nearly a decade, long before I had moved into the community. The neat organization suggested someone had spent significant time curating the information, which added gravity to the situation. These weren't random stolen files. They were a deliberate archive. I opened the earliest folder first. What I found made my gut tighten. There were scanned documents, meeting minutes, notes from board sessions, drafts of letters that had never been sent, and spreadsheets that weren't part of any financial report the HOA had ever publicly disclosed. Many of the files were annotated with comments that indicated internal disagreements or concerns that had been hidden from the community. The tone of the documents from early years was cautious but still professional, hinting at small disputes between board members about budgets or bylaw interpretations. Then, as I moved through successive folders, the tone shifted noticeably. The documents grew more fragmented, as though internal processes had deteriorated. Spreadsheets became messy, numbers inconsistent or missing altogether. Financial allocations began appearing under vague categories that lacked detail. Administrative, discretionary, and community improvement funds increased dramatically, yet there were no corresponding renovations or improvements in the neighborhood during those years. A pattern of unaccounted expenses emerged, small at first, then rapidly ballooning in later years. By the time I reached the most recent folders, the tone of the content had changed from sloppy to alarming. There were internal memos referencing containment of dissenting homeowners, lists of individuals who had questioned fees, and strategy notes on how to neutralize pushback. The same categories I'd seen briefly in the scattered papers, the compliant, borderline, and problematic labels, were now clearly outlined in official documents. Some homeowners had lengthy entries written about them, documenting minor property issues, social behaviors, and even personal disputes. It was surveillance disguised as administrative record-keeping. But beyond tracking individuals, the documents revealed something far more damning. Several entries described unexplained withdrawals from HOA accounts, accompanied by vague justifications such as legal consultations, urgent repairs, or emergency administrative expenditures. None of these events were ever announced to the community. Some withdrawals were flagged internally by a treasurer whose name appeared frequently in the earlier years, but abruptly disappeared in later records. There were notes hinting at disagreements within the board, specifically pushback from this treasurer, followed by a cryptic remark in a later memo stating the board had accepted his unexpected resignation. There were no follow-up explanations. It was impossible not to consider that the resignation had been forced. In the final folder, the one containing the most recent files, the evidence became unmistakable. There were emails outlining coordinated efforts to pressure homeowners who challenged fines. There were drafts of letters threatening legal action against residents who attempted to run for the board. There were even internal discussions outlining plans to reassign deeded parking spots, including mine, all under the guise of promoting community equity. The commentary was chillingly casual, treating legality as an obstacle rather than a boundary. Most disturbing of all was the presence of what appeared to be an unofficial financial ledger. This ledger differed from the sanitized budget summaries sent to residents. It listed several large transfers to an account whose ownership was redacted or hidden beneath layers of vague descriptors. The amounts were substantial, far more than needed for any typical neighborhood expense. Even with my limited accounting knowledge, the irregularities were unmistakable. Money had gone missing. A lot of it. The HOA's attempt to seize my parking spot was nothing more than the latest tactic in a long-running pattern of overreach and financial manipulation. They were betting on residents being too intimidated, too overwhelmed, or too confused to challenge them. But now, thanks to the anonymous homeowner, they had been exposed. I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the evidence. My situation wasn't an isolated feud. It was a symptom of a larger, festering problem. The HOA wasn't acting out of misguided fairness. They were acting out of necessity, trying to maintain control because loss of control meant exposure. Now, they had every reason to fear me. The files illuminated motives behind everything. The sudden reclassification of my parking space wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated distraction to hide the financial discrepancies surfacing within the board's operations. If they could drag me through enough bureaucratic chaos, they believed I wouldn't have the bandwidth or clarity to investigate further. But the USB changed everything. The evidence was too extensive, too detailed, too thorough to ignore. Someone inside the community had taken a risk, compiling years' worth of secrets and passing them to me. This meant there were fractures in the HOA's internal structure. Not everyone on the board was complicit, or at least not everyone could stomach what the leadership had become. I realized then that going public wasn't just a choice, it was a responsibility. Still, I knew uploading everything immediately would paint a target on the person who had given me the files. Even if their identity wasn't obvious, the HOA would search relentlessly. I had to protect them, which meant strategizing my release carefully, blending their evidence with mine in a way that obscured its origin. As I organized the files and cross-referenced them with my documentation, a new problem emerged. There were several references to an upcoming change the HOA was preparing, something planned in the coming weeks that seemed to involve increased dues, restructured parking assignments, and stricter enforcement guidelines. The vague language made the planned shift feel ominous, as though the board was preparing a sweeping power grab under the guise of administrative updates. If this plan moved forward, it could give the HOA even more authority and make it harder for residents to fight back. Time was running out. The evidence on the USB wasn't just a revelation, it was a warning. Before I could formulate a plan, before I could protect the neighbors quietly resisting, before I could even hit upload, another letter arrived at my door. This one wasn't a violation, or a fine, or a restriction. It was a summons. An official notice demanding my appearance at an emergency HOA disciplinary hearing. The HOA wasn't waiting for me to act. They were moving first. The summons to the emergency HOA disciplinary hearing arrived with an air of finality, as though the board wanted to project a sense of inevitability. The envelope was thick, stamped with the association's seal, and worded in a way that suggested the outcome had already been decided. It referenced multiple violations, community disruption, and failure to comply with administrative directives. The tone was almost triumphant, as though the HOA believed they had finally cornered me. What they didn't realize was that every attempt to intimidate me only strengthened my resolve. The USB drive had shifted the power dynamic, turning the board's aggression into desperate noise against the backdrop of genuine corruption. The hearing wasn't a threat anymore. It was an opportunity, one the HOA didn't understand they were giving me. Still, the moment I stepped outside on the morning of the hearing, their strategy became clearer. 3 board members were already stationed at the end of my driveway, arms folded, clipboards clutched to their chests. Their presence wasn't necessary. They weren't there to escort me. They were there to remind the neighborhood who they believed held control. They watched me leave my house, watched me walk down the sidewalk, watched every step like wardens tracking an inmate. Several neighbors peered through blinds or from behind partially opened curtains, aware that something significant was happening. The hearing was to be held in the small community center, normally the site of potlucks, weekend craft fairs, and holiday gatherings. But the moment I pushed open the door, the atmosphere inside felt nothing like a neighborhood event. The room had been reconfigured to resemble a courtroom imitation, with folding tables set up in rigid lines. At the far end, the board members sat behind a long table, positioned slightly above the level of the chairs arranged for attendees. A deliberate elevation, a makeshift throne. Only a handful of residents were present, but the ones who were there watched intently, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The board had framed the meeting as a measure to address a disruptive homeowner, but the weight of the moment lingered in the air, and several attendees shifted uncomfortably as though sensing an undercurrent they couldn't yet identify. The board chair opened with a rehearsed list of grievances. They cited my supposed infractions: trash bins, shrub height, lighting temperature, general noncompliance, and, of course, the reassignment of the parking spot. They spoke of me as though I were a threat to community order, someone undermining stability and harmony. Every accusation reinforced their narrative, one where they were protectors and I was the destabilizing force. But beneath the polished facade of authority, there was a flicker of anxiety in their posture. The way they glanced at one another between points, the way they emphasized procedure, the way their hands fidgeted with papers or pens. They were attempting to appear confident, but the effort was strained. They didn't know what I had or what I might reveal in response. As they finished their carefully scripted list, the room shifted. Eyes turned toward me, expecting a rebuttal, a defense, some explanation or plea. The board expected anger or panic, the same reactions they'd drawn from countless homeowners over the years. Their disciplinary hearings traditionally served as vehicles for humiliation and capitulation. Instead, I remained calm. This wasn't the moment to reveal everything, at least not yet. The USB's files needed to be released in a way that couldn't be contained or spun. This hearing, however, presented an opportunity to plant seeds. Seeds that would sprout into questions. Questions that would spread. I stood still, steady, and instead of engaging with their accusations, I simply placed a thick folder on the table before me. The folder wasn't even opened, but its presence alone carried a quiet menace. It represented information they didn't have, actions they hadn't anticipated, and documentation they hadn't prepared to face. The board members stiffened visibly, their practiced confidence flickering under the possibility that their carefully constructed narrative was about to shatter. The silence that followed was heavier than any outburst. The board chair cleared their throat, asked whether I intended to respond, but the tension was already spreading. The mere suggestion that I possessed evidence, real evidence, affected the room like a crack forming in a dam. And though I didn't speak, the weight of the folder implied volumes. It implied knowledge. It implied leverage. And it implied consequences. The board members exchanged glances, their false certainty unraveling. They shifted in their seats and hastily announced they would review the matter further, postponing any decision. The hearing, meant to serve as their decisive blow, devolved into an awkward retreat. They adjourned abruptly, their authority eroding in real time. The neighbors saw it too. Several exchanged looks. A few whispered to each other. The myth of an untouchable HOA board had fractured. The hearing that was supposed to intimidate me had instead weakened them. Outside, however, the board's reaction was swift. Within an hour of the hearing ending, a notice appeared in the community newsletter declaring that the HOA would be implementing temporary procedural changes due to ongoing disruptions. It was thinly veiled panic disguised as policy. New fines were introduced. New enforcement rules appeared, almost all centered around behavioral compliance. The board was tightening its grip, attempting to regain control before residents could ask questions. But the cracks were widening faster than they could patch them. Later that day, I received yet another anonymous letter, this one clearly written under immense pressure. The neighbor warned that the board had convened a private emergency meeting following the hearing, furious and scrambling. They were discussing ways to silence dissent, considering legal threats, and even mentioning possible attempts to ban homeowners from sharing HOA information online. Their desperation was growing, and with desperation came mistakes. The neighbor urged me to act quickly. The files on the USB weren't just incriminating. They were time-sensitive. The board was preparing something dramatic, something they wanted to pass before anyone could challenge it. A sweeping amendment to the bylaws, giving them unprecedented control over property appearance, parking assignments, and punitive fines. If approved, it would grant them the power they've been slowly grasping for years. The community had tolerated their behavior too long. They assumed the HOA operated within the law because they always had before. They trusted rules that were never questioned. But now the truth was about to surface. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and shadows stretched across the street, I sat at my computer with the video editing software open. The final video was ready, a comprehensive expose combining my footage, the violation notices, the surveillance camera, the HOA's invasive actions, and the damning evidence from the USB drive. This time, I didn't hesitate. I hit upload. What happened next would reach far beyond our quiet neighborhood. The video went live just after midnight, Its thumbnail a bold image of the parking spot, the surveillance camera, and a blurred screenshot of the file from the USB drive. By the time the sun rose, the view count had already surged past anything I'd ever posted online. Comments poured in from across the country. Homeowners, renters, former HOA board members, and people who simply enjoyed the dramatic unraveling of a corrupt authority. The story struck a chord deeper than I expected. It wasn't just about my parking spot. It was a reflection of something many people had endured quietly. The unchecked power of small governing bodies, the slow creep of control disguised as community management, and the fear of speaking out against those who wielded authority with impunity. By mid-morning, the video had gone viral. Several major commentary channels picked it up within hours, dissecting the footage, analyzing the documents, and amplifying the story. The comments sections across platforms became battlegrounds of personal anecdotes and communal outrage. People shared their own experiences, absurd fines, retaliatory actions, HOA boards run like private kingdoms. The story resonated because it was symbolic, a mirror held up to thousands of similar stories. The first reaction from the HOA was immediate and explosive. Early that morning, a hastily composed email was sent to all homeowners, claiming the video was misleading, inaccurate, and defamatory. The language was frantic, the tone defensive. They urged residents to disregard online misinformation and hinted at legal action. But the attempt at damage control backfired instantly. Screenshots of the email leaked online within minutes, fueling more outrage. The HOA's generic denials only made the evidence appear stronger, especially when juxtaposed with the meticulous documentation I had presented. Within 24 hours, local news outlets picked up the story. Reporters appeared in the neighborhood with cameras and microphones, interviewing residents who were willing to speak. Some stayed quiet out of fear, but others, emboldened by the exposure, began sharing their own clashes with the board. Stories emerged of elderly residents receiving fines for trivial issues, of families singled out for arbitrary enforcement, of board members using HOA funds to reimburse themselves for questionable expenses. Once the silence broke, it shattered completely. The HOA found itself facing scrutiny it had never imagined. Financial transparency requests flooded their inbox. Local journalists requested interviews and public statements. Homeowners who once complied out of fear now demanded accountability. The board, which had always operated from a position of unquestioned control, was suddenly cornered. Then came the final blow. A state-level consumer protection agency reached out publicly, announcing they were opening an investigation into the HOA's financial practices and administrative conduct. The agency cited the evidence presented in the viral video, alongside the growing number of homeowners coming forward with corroborating details. The words potential misconduct and misappropriation of funds were suddenly attached to the board's name across television broadcasts and online articles. The community underwent a seismic shift in a matter of days. The board's authority, once absolute, crumbled. Their attempts to enforce new fines or issue new violations were ignored or openly mocked. Neighbors held conversations out in the open, no longer whispering or glancing over their shoulders. A sense of liberation took hold, as though the very air felt lighter in the absence of looming fear. A week after the video was posted, a mandatory emergency meeting was announced. But this time, the board didn't command the room. Residents filled the community center, standing shoulder to shoulder, their expressions resolute. The board members appeared overwhelmed, frazzled, and diminished. Gone were the confident postures and clipped tones. They looked like people who had been dragged into a spotlight far brighter than they ever expected to face. The treasurer resigned first, citing health concerns. The secretary followed, offering a vague statement about needing to focus on family. The board president held out the longest, attempting to defend their actions, but the mounting pressure was too great. The revelation of unaccounted funds, written in their own internal documents, left them with nowhere to hide. Under threat of legal action and overwhelming resident demand, the president stepped down as well. The HOA entered a state of restructuring under external supervision. A third-party auditing firm was brought in to review the financial account from the past decade. Rumors swirled about pending charges, though official statements remained careful and tight-lipped. The neighborhood, once the stage for quiet oppression, transformed into a community finally allowed to breathe. But the aftermath wasn't just administrative, it was social. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now approached one another openly. People shared relief, swapped stories, and even laughed at the absurdity of some of the past fines. The parking spot became a symbol of the rebellion. An emblem of the moment a very ordinary homeowner reached a breaking point and made an entire system answer for its behavior. In the weeks that followed, my video continued to spread. It was featured in national segments about housing disputes, governance abuse, and the importance of transparency. The neighborhood became a case study, a warning, and a rallying cry. Even as repairs were made, bylaws rewritten, and leadership replaced, the story lived on in the collective conversation of homeowners across the country. Eventually, the dust settled. The surveillance camera was removed. The retaliatory violations were formally voided. The towing threats were retracted. And my parking spot, officially and legally mine from the start, remained exactly where it always had been, untouched, undeniable, and now known across millions of screens. Standing there one quiet evening, looking at that simple space of pavement illuminated by the street lamp, I realized how strange it was that something so small had sparked something so massive. A single parking spot had ignited a movement, exposed corruption, empowered a community, and reshaped a narrative far larger than my own experience. The HOA had tried to seize something that belonged to me. Instead, they lost everything they had taken from the community over the years: trust, control, secrecy. The board was replaced. Transparency was mandated, and a sense of unity returned, stronger than before. The story had reached its end, but its message remained. When people stand together, even the smallest battles can ripple outward into national change. And with that, the saga closed. If you also hate HOAs, then make sure to subscribe and like.